Welcome to the first of our video workshops, video research workshops sponsored by the Lamb School, CCSE, and the AMAP group at Purdue. Our goal is to introduce you to the methods and ideas that can be used to analyze video and text from the C-SPAN Video Library. I'm Robert Browning, Faculty Director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. And we'd like to tell you to mute your Zoom, put it in speaker view so you can see our speaker and myself. And if you have questions, we'll hope you will, send them to everyone in the chat. Just check on everyone. And Connie Debley, the center managing director, will ask the questions, and that way Professor Hart won't have to keep track of all the questions coming in. Our guest today is Professor Roderick P. Hart as the Alan Shivers Centennial Chair of the Moody School of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the author of 12 books on political communication and tone. He's the creator of the Diction Text Analysis program, which he's going to talk about today. He's also a former dean of the Moody School. And we will say that after his PhD from Penn State, he spent his formative years here at Purdue University. And so join me in welcoming Roderick Hart.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here today. And let me get my screen shared. So it's like coming home, although it's about 68 degrees here in Austin, and I remember my my days earlier at Purdue. I want to take you back to 1970. Purdue was facing a crisis. It had lost Lenny Dawson, a great quarterback for Purdue. Bob Greasy had graduated, another great quarterback, and Drew Brees was not yet born. And so Purdue was in a great deal of trouble at the time. And so the faculty football team was sharing that trouble. It had a good deal of important resources, though. It had a very fine running back in Ralph Webb, and had two excellent wide receivers in Dave Berg and Lee Trackman, and a monster on the line in Gus Friedrich and Don Ellis, but it didn't have a quarterback. And so Purdue recruited me in 1970, and I spent my first 9 years there, and they were happy years indeed, and I have great loyalty and affection to the university for having gotten my career started. So I'm happy to be all with you today. By the way, the faculty football team, we only had 6 on the faculty that could play. And so the doctoral students that were ABD were recruited to play on the faculty team against all the other graduate students. So that's how we were able to field a team. It's not surprising to all of you that we live in a world of big data. We see that every day, and certainly COVID is telling us a good deal about how big data is being used to both understand the disease, but also how to treat it and deal with it. Big data, Bill Gilchrist has said that the belief that the more data you have, the more insights and answers will rise automatically from the pools of ones and zeros. And we see big data all around us today in so many different ways. Big text is something different, and lots of people come at it and they call it different things depending upon the discipline you're in: sentiment analysis, text mining, lexical tracking, corpus analytics. When I started out, it was called computerized language analysis. What I think big text does is it helps us flag things that are subtle, repetitive, and potentially important in the text. So it's a great discovery tool. And what I like about it is it tends to, for me at least, call attention to things that we know, but we can't really readily explain. We have a sense of it, but we don't have words for it. And I think that's what's always attracted me to this sort of work. Well, my work in this area started in my doctoral dissertation, but really it was in my 9 years at Purdue from 1970 to 1979, where I got much more involved in computerized language analysis. And I realized that most of you don't know what these things are, but for people of a certain age, they will know they're computer cards. And I, on many, many days, took a bunch of them over to, from Hevelin Hall over to the Math Science Building and put them into the stacks to be put into the university computer. And then you'd wait there for half an hour or so, and then you'd find out that you had forgotten to put the 6, 7, 8, 9 card in the right place, and then you'd put it back in and wait for another bit of time. But it was a way of, for me, getting to understand how to use the power of computing to understand more about language behavior. And so I wanted to create a piece of software, but I only knew one computer programmer, and that computer programmer only knew one computer language, COBOL. And so that was the first version of the program. And of course, that's as I've come to understand, a very odd format for creating a piece of software that does language analysis, but that's why it started out that way. And of course, it's gotten much more sophisticated since that time. But Laura Stevens was my go-to gal in the program start. So the program that resulted from it is called Diction, and it's a, as you might imagine, based program that passes over a large set of texts looking for specific things. And I'm going to tell you about a little bit about what the program does and also some of the things that I found using it. We are in a month or so, we're going to put out a little agenda next to Diction called Diction Bits, which is going to make it much easier to draw Twitter data into the program. There is if anybody's interested, on the dictionsoftware.com, there's a series of tutorials. They're 5 minutes apiece, and you can get a sense of what the program does and how it functions. And you can also try it out. There's without paying for it, you can try it out and see what kind of output you get with the program. And for me, what all this is another kind of way of using one's mind to understand what messages are about. And I like to think of it as finding the questions that are embedded in messages, questions that we don't fully understand. One of the things that makes Diction different from the other kind of software products out there is that Diction has built into it, 20 or 30 years worth of research, so that there are normative data provided. So if you put in a passage, not only does it tell you how many X's there are versus Y's, but it also tells you what that means relative to a set of normative data that have been built into the program. So you can instantly understand whether the passage you submitted is unique or part of some broader pattern. And the program is built on this kind of normative basis, that we only understand something because of something else, compare things that we hear to things that we've already heard. And that's how knowledge develops. And you and I are not conscious of making these kind of comparisons, even though we do. And ultimately, I suggest you can't know one thing without knowing two things. You can't know what Wednesday is like without being able to compare it immediately, at least, to Tuesday. And so it's a little colder, or it's a little warmer, or there's more sun, or more snow. And that's how you know what Wednesday is. But if it weren't for Tuesday, you wouldn't be able to know as much about Wednesday as you wanted to know. So everything that diction does is compares messages to a normative database. And I think that's what makes the program different from a lot of others out there. Now, I know there's a lot of social scientists listening, and I apologize for using a word that drives social scientists crazy, and that's the word tone. Tone is used in all kinds of ways, visually and auditory tone. And of course, literary people talk about tone. And one of the things that I've tried to do is to try to put some numbers to tone to make it a more, if you will, disciplined construct. And I do so on the basis of what Sherlock Holmes once told Watson. Holmes said, you know, Watson, he says, you can tell everything you need to know about a man by looking at their shoes. And Watson says, what do you mean, Holmes? That sounds bizarre. And he says, well, he said, you can look to see whether or not the heel has been worn down. If it's been worn down, he says, that's the sign of an enterprising and busy fellow. And he said, if you can see if the shoes are shined or not. He said, a shine shoe, well, now that's a man that's going to go somewhere in life, as opposed to someone who's not very careful. All you need to know about a man, says Holmes, is to look at his shoes. Now, most of us don't spend much time looking at people's shoes. And that's what I think is fun about doing kind of computerized language analysis. And diction assumes that tone emerges from individual word choices that cumulatively build up to produce patterned expectations that tell us something important about our current circumstances. Individual word choices. You and I don't pay attention to our individual word choices. They somehow just pour out of us. But they also do it cumulatively. And so we get to understand people by the ways in which they produce language. And we develop our own patterned expectations on the basis of what Robert might have said yesterday versus what he said on other times. And so we get to understand who Robert is by comparing what he's saying at this moment to things that he said in the past. And these kind of lexical choices tell us something important about the people that are around. So that's a kind of conceptual understanding of tone. But from a more precise point of view, it's what I call lexical layering. That all of our messages are built in layers. And these layers are made up of what I call word families that are distinctive individually, but when they're used together, they have become mutually implicative. They imply things about each other. And tone becomes richer when these different word families are brought together. And I'll be giving you examples of that. Tone also becomes more identifiable when word families are commingled. So you might say, well, gee, I think that Connie seems a little troubled today. And you say, well, why? Well, because she doesn't have, she wasn't talking about her pet alligator. And she's always talks about her pet alligator. And she didn't do that today. And I wonder if something's wrong. And we develop these histories of one another. And that tells us where we are. We monitor, we posit ourselves in a universe with poles identified by people's language behavior. And lexical layering helps explain what we sense but can't specify. And so we might say, well, something, I don't know, Connie seems a little disturbed today, and we may not have paid much attention to her always talking about our pet alligator until we start to study it. And so that's what lexical layering is about. It's looking at what happens when all these words come together in the families with which they're associated. So here is a truly banal news story coming out of Washington that if you read through it, if you can, you probably will fall asleep before the end of it. There's nothing very special about this, but I ask you to look at it, at how colorful it is. You know, what is it that makes this a news story? And part of it is, if you look at the various codes there, it draws upon a wide array of things. There's evidence of the president being involved. There's the House members, the bureaucracy. Well, that's kind of a Washington story. But then there's unhappiness, and look at all the unhappiness that's there. And ideology, partisanship, references to political parties, and of course, money. So what makes politics politics? At least in part, it's the fact that we bring together these different layers of language from very different places, and they come together to make this a political news story. So if I asked you before showing you this, what's a political news story? You might have gotten there, but in a way, what programs like Diction does is it goes and finds these families of words for you and says, I don't know really what it means, but I'll tell you that they all showed up at the same time in this same text. And that's what lexical layering is about. And I think that's where tone comes from, that when you put together these institutional actors plus some political emotion, plus money and party, you get a political news story. So this is what Diction does. It has about 10,000 search words, and they're grouped in these, what are called dictionaries, as you can see there. One of the things that makes Diction different, it was built specifically to deal with political language because that's what I study. But in fact, it's been used for all kinds of purposes in other areas as well. And what Diction does is it takes these individual dictionaries and it concatenates them into 5 master variables. So if you will, the rectangular variables are added up. The oval variables are subtracted from them. All of this is done with normative data, of course, and then they produce these 5 master variables. The notion when I got started on this was if you could only know 5 things about a political document, I, and drawing on research, said it would be good to know how strong versus how weak it is, whether it's ambivalent or is it highly certain, optimistic or pessimistic. Is there active language versus passive language? Is it highly realistic, concrete, or is it abstract? Is it speaking of things that bring us together, or is it things that divide us? And of course, you can probably see why I picked those 5 dimensions, because politics really hinges on those things in so many ways. This may not seem a particularly attractive figure to you, but it's really important to me because it took me a very long time to build a system showing that there are essentially no significant correlations among any of these 5 master variables over tens of thousands of, which means that every time Diction looks at a passage, it looks at it in 5 completely different ways, thereby quintupling your money, if you will. But what it does is it opens up these layers And knowing one thing, you can't predict the other thing. The reason that's important is that in real life, in fact, in many circumstances, there will be relationships between, say, optimism and activity, or commonality and certainty. And thereby it tells you, hey, there's something special going on here because there's no necessary relationship between or among any of these variables. So what's a dictionary? One of the things I suggest to people when they're looking about computerized language analysis or a program is to look at the dictionaries, because the most important thing about any of this stuff is not reliability, because it's computers that are doing it. It's all about validity. And so if you look at this list of words and it doesn't remind you of space, then this is not the program for you to use. And you can go to the program, you can go to the software and you can look at all of the search words that it uses. And I said before, I started it out to use with political stuff, but it's been used in a variety of studies and dozens of disciplines in ways that I never would have imagined. And a few years ago, we had a national conference here at UT Austin in which we brought people from 15 different disciplines who had all used the program. And it was a very interesting conference because people had studied such vastly different things, but coming together and seeing, well, what in fact do we know together? I want to distinguish between two different kinds of policemen. The beat cop is a close reader. This is Officer Mulligan. He walks around the neighborhood. He knows all the shopkeepers. He talks to them. They talk to him. He's got a very textured understanding of what the neighborhood is about. A helicop is a different kind of cop. He doesn't know the shopkeepers' names and faces. All he can do is see from a distance. But he can give us some interesting data that Officer Mulligan can't give us. The helicop can see patterns of traffic forming, and that's going to create problems for the downtown area. He can also see the lights on next to the butcher shop at 3 o'clock in the morning, and that doesn't seem like a good thing. So he calls down to the guys in the traffic and said, "You better check Mr. Jones's meat shop because there's a light there and there might be a burglary going on." So because the helicop can't see very closely, he can still see a great deal. And in a lot of ways, computerized language analysis is like the helicop. It can't get close like you and I can get close parsing over a poem. What it can do, though, is it can see things that we would miss because we were too close to the people on Officer Mulligan's beat. So the premises that I follow in the research that I've done are these, that we have a lot of implicit knowledge about the world that we don't really recognize. We use this knowledge to make decisions all the time. We don't know we have the knowledge, but our knowledge of the world leaks out. And by studying the leakage, we can learn how we know what we know. It is not hard for me to ask you what you know, and you'll quickly tell me what you know. If I ask you how you know what you know, usually that stops us dead in our tracks. And we say, well, it's just because I know it. But how we know what we know is really the most important question. For about, 30 years now, we've been running something called the Campaign Mapping Project at UT Austin, looking at political discourse generated during presidential election campaigns from 1948 through this last wonderful election we've had. And I've milked the software for all it's worth over the years, looking in different ways at how language comes together in political messaging. Most recent, which is trumping up us. And I hadn't intended to write about a book about Trump, but he just intrigued me, and his language is really quite astonishing, as I'm sure you all know. There are 4 dimensions that I've focused upon over the years. That is the influence of personality on political life, epistemology, how we know things, institutions, and partisanship. And I want to just give you a few data bits of studies that I've done to show you the kind of thing that you can learn by looking at things from the helicopter's point of view. So personality. Politicians are sources of power, but they're also individuals. They have personalities. And one of the things when you do this kind of work, a lot of times you come upon data that you didn't anticipate and you didn't necessarily want, but it intrigues you, and so you followed it. And that's what happened to me when looking at the McCain race and his wonderful vice presidential candidate, Sarah Palin. And I found some data that made me stop in my tracks, and I had to follow this up. And I found some things interesting about her, but also about myself. One of the things we know from survey data is that Sarah Palin had evoked bipolar reactions, tremendously so. People loved her or hate her, and they were really strong about that. A little bit like they are with Donald Trump. And so the question is, well, why? Why would this woman who dragged out of the state of Alaska to run suddenly for vice president of the United States, why would people have such bipolar antithetical reactions? Was it because of gender bias that somehow she didn't talk the way we expect women to talk? Was it because she's from a kind of a far off place we don't know much about, and so we had questions about her? She was clearly from a lower middle class background. Is that why people laughed at her a lot of times? Was it just because she was a certain kind of Republican? And was it a press bias? The press just thought she was a doofus, and so they turned us against her. She was nominally religious, and sometimes that bothers people in politics. Was it the way she talked? And so I looked at these things. I couldn't get her out of my head. And one of the kind of what I call a silly little variable is one of the ones that I've come to really trust the most. And it's insistence. And that is the any word that occurs 3 or more times in a 5-word passage times how often it occurs divided by 10. So this is not complicated linguistics. But I have found over the years that insistence tells us a great deal about things because it's really a measure of what might be called topical maintenance or agenda control. And what I found with Palin convinced me of its importance. So these are data for a large set of discourses. And the question here is, how focused is the text? So if you see at the focused end where you have financial reports, high insistence, meaning they talk about the same stuff again and again and again. Legal documents, scientific journals, student essays. My guess is a lot of the research written by people that are listening in today are probably pretty high on insistence because that makes it for much more serious kinds of things. And then as you go down and across the diagram here, you get to the point where things are much less insistent, where there's much more variety in the things that are being discussed. And that's where Sarah Palin is, right down there next to sitcoms. And when I came upon these data, I thought, well, this is terrific because we all know she's sort of a doofus, and this proves it. And I can just go write an article and say, I prove that Sarah Palin is an idiot, and I've got numerical data to prove it. And these are political candidates from 1948 through 2012. And there she is, right at the bottom. In other words, Sarah Palin wanders when she talks. She doesn't stay on message. She doesn't stay on things that are the same topic again and again and again. But then I started to think about, well, why would anyone be attracted to this person? Here's the kind of thing she says. Maybe tempting and more comfortable to just keep your head down, plod along, and appease those who demand sit down up. But that's the worthless easy path. That's a quitter's way out. And so what these data did is made me confront my own biases about Sarah Palin. It made me open the door to thinking about, well, why would someone be attracted to someone who is low on insistence? And it's because of these kind of interpersonal qualities that some Americans saw, and they said, I don't care that she doesn't stay on topic. What I think is really interesting is the way she's open to me, and I can feel at one with her, someone I can trust as a result. And so what these studies showed me, at least, was that what some people hated about Sarah Palin is the same thing that other people loved about her. And it was always the same thing, that she wandered when she talks. And this is one of those kind of personality variables that I think was interesting. Epistemology, about how do truth claims intersect with political life. Really wonderful essay written many years ago by Richard Hofstadter called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. Hofstadter was a professor at Columbia, and he was trying to understand the 1950s and Joe McCarthy, and came up with this understanding of the paranoid style. And he described it as a historian might, but he didn't operationalize it, of course, because that wasn't his business. And I noticed during the 2016 race and thereafter that people kept bringing up this concept of the paranoid style when talking about Donald. So I asked myself questions. Well, what is this thing called a paranoid style? I mean, what is it empirically? Can it be measured? Did Trump, in fact, use it? When did he use it? How did he use it? Why did he use it? And what does it mean? Well, that was good to have questions. But then the question, of course, is because Hofstadter never operationalized it, it came to me to do so. So after a lot of thinking about it, I came up with 3 dimensions of the paranoid style: a sense of isolation, that you're all by yourself, that you're suffering some kind of harm or affliction, and that you're upset about it. And so I worked with these various kinds of measures to see if I could find a way of tapping this style. And here are some data that I've updated just recently. And you can see, at least by the way I built this measure of the paranoid style, that Trump was off the charts. And he was even higher in 2020 than he was in 2016. And so to me, this was it was an interesting thing to take concepts that are rich but also ambiguous, and to see if I can find ways of putting them to the test. Another interesting thing, a little anecdote, is used a measure of exaggeration. And you can see again what Trump's strategy, not only was he using the paranoid style, but he used a great number of exaggerations as well. And my hope is that as you look at these data, you say, well, yeah, that makes sense. I would have known that. And of course, that's good once you have the data. But for me, what the fun part about this is trying to take concepts that are ambiguous, tones that we sense but can't touch, and find ways see if we can't track them down. And here's another interesting little piece of information. I've got a large sample of letters to the editor from 1948 to the present in 12 small American cities that I've been tracking again and again. And one of the things that hasn't been noticed is that over time, ordinary citizens have been making increasing use of the paranoid style. So in some of the data are Trump data, but it may be that sense of isolation and affliction had been growing in the nation's small towns and cities, and that in fact Trump may well be aficionado of the paranoid style, but he may also be a very good listener. And maybe he was hearing this stuff over time so that we and Trump are implicated together in this story. Institutional questions. I spent a lot of time thinking about the press and politicians. And why do they fight so much? And I think my answer is because they're largely jealous of one another. So one of the things that I have tried on a number of occasions was to build a measure of what I call narrative force. And to me, a story is a case in which a narrator remembers something personally, some activity that occurred somewhere with other people at a certain time. Now, this is not Hemingway's definition of a story, but it's my crude kind of empirical way of looking at self-references and motion and space and people and time. And when these things come together, I reckon, we hear something like a story. And here are the data over time. And it looks like it should be upside down. What these data are saying is that politicians use much heavier, make heavier use of the narrative style than reporters. And you say that makes no sense. Reporters tell us the story. Reporters tell us what's going on. Well, reporters do tell us something, but they don't tell us stories in the classical sense of stories. But politicians do. To me, that's really, really interesting. So here's a politician telling us a story about a guy named Ramon. We're rooting for guys like Ramon. Spent 8 years in the military, served in Afghanistan, served in Iraq, but he came home, had a hard time finding a job. He didn't want to be a burden on his family, so he moved into a homeless shelter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is Barack Obama telling the story of Ramon. And when I use this measure of the narrative force, and again, trying to establish validity, if you look at the ways these different things cluster, it makes a good deal of sense. You know, social scientists in the room, you're probably not going to get that article published by telling a story about Ramon. That's just not the way we do things here in the world of social science. But you could do TV drama and write a short story and write a theater script and use high narrative force. And if you're in the news business, you can be somewhere in between social science scholarship and TV drama. So they do tell stories in an arrested way. So here is Barack Obama announcing his decision to run for president. And he tells a story about the people in the Depression, going back to work and being lifted out of poverty, and railroads open to the West, and landing a man on the moon, and Dr. King's call for justice to roll down like the water in a mighty stream. And this is what how the New York Times described his speech. They talked a little bit about what he said, but then they quickly got into a few direct quotes from Walter Mondale and Gary Hart, and then they went over to talk about Hillary Clinton and could he possibly beat her, and what about a campaign staff, and what's his anti-war position, and was it patriotic? So they did what the press does. They did analysis. But in doing their analysis, they don't tell a story the way Barack Obama tells the story. In other words, one of the reasons for the tension between journalism and politics is the journalist's relentless focus on a specific number of topics. They're dogged. They don't let people change the subject. Politics, they use the pivot. And what's the pivot? That's a way of getting from this story to that story, to getting away from the questions you're asking to a story that I'd much rather tell. And to me, this shows a kind of inherent linguistic tension between these two institutions, the press and politics. A final set of questions. Partisan. Who's a Democrat and what's a Republican? So if I asked you what's a Democrat or Republican. You could give me a set of policy positions that these two parties would endorse. You know, small business, low taxes for Republicans, help the people on the Democratic side directly. But could it be measured? So I've spent a lot of time working on this model of partisan style. And as you can see, it's an attempt to separate all of these things conceptually, but also to find ways of measuring them. Now, I've been pretty pleased in one of the last books called Political Tone lays out the findings for this, but it works pretty well to distinguish Republicans from Democrats. And here are some data recently from this campaign, just using a piece of that, what are called commonality, and that is a reference to people and groups coming together. And as you can see, there's a consistent difference between Republicans and Democrats on that use. Democrats are the bring us together party, Republicans not so much. And you can see that Trump dropped down even further than he was in, and that's not surprising to you if you paid attention to the campaign. He was not a guy that was constantly talking about national unity versus Joe Biden. So there are interesting differences. But one of the things that I found, and at first this concerned me because the data started to get shaky. And I had to go back and look at time. And what I found is that the model worked really, really well during the primary season, like Republicans and Democrats. But as they moved into the general election season, they started to from the other side, borrow the language from the other, that when they got to the election day, they sounded more alike, less like their quintessential party types than they had during the primary season. In a way, they were together to try to appeal to that middle ground. And I think generally voters like it when they get to that in-between place. So a lot of what I've done over the years is to turn words into numbers. And I think it's important. One of the things that's wonderful is we have all this software now that can so quickly pass through tens of thousands or millions of tweets. And that's interesting and potentially helpful. But one of the things that happens when we do that, we lose the beat cop's perspective on things by staying so far away from the message that we miss the kind of face-to-face details that a text might deserve. So I've always been haunted by John Bart, who said, writing in the middle 60s, the computer could not act on a hunch or a brilliant impulse. It had no intuitions or exaltations. It could request but not yearn, indicate but not insinuate or exhort, command but not care. It had no sense of style or grasp of the ineffable. Its correlations were exact, but its metaphors wretched. It could play chess, but not poker. It's that last sentence in particular bothers me, because I study politics. And if I can't understand poker, then I'm not going to be able to understand politics. So those of us that study big text and big data are to be applauded. But with John Bart, we also have to be concerned about having a lot of that humility needed to say, look, when we translate and turn words into numbers, we're doing something that is in part unnatural. But it's understanding that unnaturalness, I think, where knowledge can potentially reside. The thing that I have liked about doing this kind of work over the years is not because it gives me answers, it's because it gives me questions. And I hope the questions I've shared with you today are at least provocative. I'll stop sharing this now.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Rod. So if you have questions, and I hope you will, send them to everyone using the chat function, and Connie will sort of read those questions. So,
Dr. Hart, I had a question come in actually earlier was about having access to your PowerPoint. Would there be any possibility for the participants to have access to your PowerPoint at some time in the future?
Sure, be happy to share it.
And here's a question. Could the diction program be used to identify things like autism?
Autism,
Yes, autism.
I don't have a clue. I don't know enough about, I know nothing about autism. I'm sure that there are people that have done linguistic studies of autistic individuals, but I'm at a loss. I study bizarre people like Donald Trump, but I don't know the autistic literature at all. You know, if autism admits to patterns or pattern differentiation, then I would think that it would, because it's a addiction, and programs like it are pattern differentiators supreme. But I just don't know whether autistic individuals are patterned in their non-patternedness.
This is a question, Dr. Hart, from Dr. Rosalie Carson. She thanks you for the presentation. She says it was very interesting and asked the question, can researchers add words to the diction dictionary?
Yeah, the program lets you create your own dictionaries, and that's a feature that I've used a great deal. So yes, and there are probably by now hundreds of dictionaries that users have created for their own purposes. So created a dictionary for patriotic terms, for example, that I've often used. So that is useful in politics. But yes, there are, and what you can do is you can ask the program to calculate them simultaneously. And then you can look at the relationships between your dictionaries and the ones that are built into the program.
Juan Pablo Ramirez asks, said to say thank you for the lecture, Dr. Hart. What is the normative database composed of?
Well, it's composed of everything I could get graduate students to do for me. I paid a lot of graduate students for a lot of summers to collect poetry and theater scripts and historical biographies and Wall Street bankers reports and everything else I could think of. And so collectively, they are the normative base. But one of the things addiction does is if you are particularly interested in financial reports from a business, for example, you can ask Diction you can pull down from a list of about, I think, 40 different genre, and you can compare your financial report to the financial reports that Diction has already processed. It's not the end all and be all, and some of those comparative groups have much more data than others. But it's not necessarily the universe of discourse. One of the things that the program doesn't have is it doesn't have social media data built into it, because of course that's something I couldn't have anticipated in 1970, nor could I have anticipated a computer you could hang in your pocket. So, and the other thing that some people have asked is, have I updated the dictionaries? And the answer is no, and I will never update them, because then one couldn't ever make comparisons across time or across discipline. And the reason I really created the program was to be able to have conversations with people from multiple disciplines. And so the dictionaries are the dictionaries that are built in, but the user can easily increment them with their own research.
This is a question from Elise Taylor. She says, how can we at Purdue try out the program? Is there any sort of trial or something along those lines?
Yeah, you can go to dictionsoftware.com, and it gives you, I think, 10 passages that you can run, and the program will run, and you can see the program running, and then you can see the output it provides. You can't put your own text in, but you can take the sample ones, and it will give you all the data that you would get if you had put your own text in.
Here's another question. What is the relationship between big data and the diction program?
Well, that's why I use the term big text. To me, there's a big difference between, one of my frustrations is that I go to a lot of conferences, particularly in communication and political science and sometimes psychology, and I go to sessions on content analysis and I see people take incredibly large samples of language and pass over them with various computer techniques, and then fill the screens on their PowerPoints with logistic regressions and various kinds of path models. And I never see any text in them. So they become numbers for the sake of numbers. So to me, is basically using pattern thinking to look for numerical clusterings of various sorts. At least that's my simple-minded definition of it. Big text is getting back to the basics of what you're studying, which is language. And so I think it's important to, and a lot of times I see these presentations and they never give me a single example of one tweet that they may have processed, even though they processed 5 million tweets. I want to see what language looks like to understand what they're finding.
Co-sponsor for this series of programs from AMAP and us, that's Dr. Jay McCann, has this question: does the Diction Dictionary include only English language words?
Yes, they are only English language. And I have a good friend who, he's a close friend, Jamie Pennybaker, who also has a language program. And he's had it put into a whole bunch of different languages. I've not done that because a lot of what diction, I think, has Anglo-Saxon implications built into a lot of the ways it calculates. And I don't believe that a simple word for word translation would accommodate that. I'm not a linguist, so I can't say that for sure, but I've resisted putting it into other languages for that reason.
James Labadorf asks, does the diction program measure sentiment magnitude like NLP programs, such as Google's sentiment analysis?
Sentiment analysis is, looking at what kind of emotions are being displayed in the text. And so, yes, particularly the ones that, and I don't know why schools of business, so many of them have used this program. And they use, particularly, all they really were interested in are optimism and pessimism. And that's really what a lot of the sentiment analysis is. Are things happy or sad? But yeah, there are a lot of ways of calculating. If you can master the validity questions, and to me, the validity questions are the most haunting questions. I've used this program now for 40 years. I still require the program to convince me that what it's measuring is something that it's really measuring. I still demand that. And so I've got a lot of data that I have not published because I have no idea why diction came up with the findings that it did. I still can't find it, so I haven't published it. If I can't find the numbers translating into the language that I can see, then to me the program isn't useful. So, that's a long answer to a smart, short question.
Paul asked this question, and I'm not sure I I received all of it. Let me give it a try. And if you understand what he's talking about, we'll go with it. But if not, I might need to have him help me out again. Thank you for the presentation. Does your research suggest that polarization among political elites, as with Fiorina, or throughout the culture, as with Bill Bishop and others?
That's a lovely question, and it's a big question. I think most of my career has been spent, and I had a slide in there that I took out because of time, but of looking at the relation language, politics, and culture. And I'd say that that's really been the axis of my career, is looking at those three things in relationship to one another. And so a lot of my books, even though they focus upon political language, they're also really a study of culture. So I don't know. In general, I think programs like diction, if they're used really intelligently, can tell us an awful lot about our cultural mores, about what people are thinking and feeling at a given moment in time, and perhaps why. And I think programs like diction are really interesting and cool ways of testing cultural assumptions about who comes together and who's not together, and whether there are possibilities for breaking through the partisan deadlocks, for example, because I know we have a lot more in common culturally than we do politically. That's a great question. Yeah. I would have to think about it for about 7 days to come up with a good answer.
So he clarifies that a little bit in asking, is it that the polarization is concentrated among elites?
To me, with question, it's concentrated among elites. I did a book, it wasn't a diction book, came out a few years ago, called Civic Hope: How Ordinary Americans Keep Democracy Alive. It's a study of these 12,000 letters to the editor written over the last 70 years. And it's my own intuitive analysis of what ordinary people are thinking. And people in these small towns that write these letters to the editor are pretty much like the average Joe, except they care more about politics. They're a couple of years older. They've lived in town longer. But that was a wonderful project, because it put me in touch with the ordinary things that people are saying in everyday America. And it didn't resemble political elites at all, except until about 2008. And you look at letters to the editor now in these 12 cities, which I've been doing recently, they sound much more like elites sound when they're talking about politics. And that worries me greatly. In other words, you and I are being intimidated into talking about things the way people on cable television talk about politics. And I think that's dangerous for the polity. But it was interesting to see that shift when suddenly that voice of the people begin to seem to be imitating the way they are supposed to be talking about politics, which is the way Rush Limbaugh talks about, or people on CNN talk about it. That worries me.
So we have some space for some more questions in the chat if you want to queue up in there. In the meantime, Dr. Browning, do you have a question?
Talk about your diction bits for a moment. Do you expect to see something completely different now?
What that program does, it's just a small little add-on to the program. It allows you to go into the fire hydrant of tweets and grab stuff and put them into 500-word clusters, which is what diction based on. So it just simply lets you wrestle with the flow of Twitter data, and it allows you to, again, you'd be able to compare it to the overall norms of the thing. Uh, I don't know. It's hard to, I don't know what's normative. I know what appears to be normative in Twitter data, and it's usually pretty hostile,
Mhm.
pretty polarized, pretty partisan. Um, there are a lot of amateur politicians on Twitter. I certainly see that, but I think it would take some. It's going to take some data. And I've done a little bit of. I did in my Trump book. I did some analysis tweets, but it was just a small. It was just a small amount of analysis. I think that's a new universe that we're going to have to
Mhm.
learn an awful lot more about.
Dr. Hart, this question from Parker Hamill. Are you worried about the negative impact which online interactions could bring to your data given the anonymity?
Yeah, I mean, I like nothing anonymity. So yes, I mean, I don't think it's going to. I think there's no question that you and I speak differently when we presume that we're anonymous than when we presume that we're not, which is why I hate anonymity, because um, being not anonymous makes us more responsible. And we've known that since we were kids and did something wrong and thought we were getting away with it. So yeah, I think anonymity is it's one of the curses of social media, in my opinion. I've had a wonderful argument with a colleague of mine, Craig Scott, who studies organizational behavior, and he's a big fan of anonymity because it allows people who are lower on the food chain to be able to complain about things going on in the are inappropriate, and they wouldn't have outed people unless they were anonymous. So I have great sympathy for that point of view. Having said that, my sympathy doesn't go very long in the air when it comes to politics. So yeah, it's something I worry a good deal about.
Paul wants to underscore to you saying a good point that people have more in common culturally than politically, even as your research is showing that politics is overwhelming culture. Are politicians or polls getting better at persuasion, or are average citizens finding reasons to take politics more seriously?
I think it's great that citizens are taking politics seriously. I think I'm heartened by the turnout in this last election. A lot of really angry people voted on both sides. And I'm sorry that they're angry, but I'm glad that they showed up. We all should be rooting for Joe Biden to calm things down, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, because democracy's fragile. We were certainly tested recently in the nation's capital. So I think we all have to, and you look at what's happened to families, where that awful Thanksgiving dinner, where after a couple of glasses of wine, cousin Bob and Uncle Jim squared off. We got a lot of things to worry about. So we could all use 4 years of sitting and soaking, as they say in Texas.
Dr. Hart, how many people, or can you give us a feel for how many people are doing the kind of research you're doing across the country? Is there a big group of you, or is it very small?
Oh, well, there are a lot more of us now than there were in 1970 when I was walking across the campus to the math science building with my computer cards. So at least, the two disciplines that I'm closest to, political science, and I have an appointment in political science, and I was at conventions many years ago where political scientists didn't want anything to do with communication or messaging. You know, it was all survey data, once in a experimental data. But now you go to political science conferences and session after session after session that are dealing with various kinds of text analytical methods. So at least in communication and political science, there's a tremendous amount of work. Lots of people doing lots of different things, much more sophisticated than I can. In my approach is what some people call a bag of words approach, and it's meant to be disparaging. You just get a bag of words and you shake it up, and then you learn something. That's okay. I don't mind it being disparaging, because I always enjoy asking people how they know what they know. And usually that stops people in their tracks, because most of us don't know how we know what we know. And it frustrates us when someone observes that we don't know how we know what we know. That's part about this research. So there's a lot of it going on certainly in psychology, sociology, political science, communication. Interestingly, not as much in linguistics as you might have imagined, but that's because linguistics is such a complex discipline where there's a lot of different kind of epistemological rivalries. But it seems to me a lot of people who do that within my field. So you look across disciplines really to find your partners.
We have a few minutes left. This is a question from Bo Blue. He wants to know if you have any experience using diction with the API, like the C-SPAN Archives API.
And that's awful because my host for today, my wonderful host, I have not. I've used APIs for other cases, but I've not used the C-SPAN API. I do know that some of my students have used it, but I have not personally.
If you would, if I can ask one last question here, if a grad student came to you and said, the whole video library exists there with all this text that we extract, should we study elites? Should we study audiences? Should we study the president? What's a great kind of thing you would say to point to, even not specific, but the kind of things we might learn?
Well, you know, I spent my career doing presidential studies, and so I'm not a congressional scholar. I've got a really wonderful friend here on campus who studies Congress and has done some work with C-SPAN. So I think from congressional scholars are particularly advantaged by the archive. I think that's certainly the visual stuff. There are more and more people in the field of communication that are doing much more sophisticated stuff with visual properties. And I don't know if artificial intelligence is going to help us in that way, but my guess is that it would be. But I will mention one study that has haunted me ever since it was proposed to me, and I think it was probably 20 years ago, by a professor by the name of Robert Browning at Purdue University.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you know, Rod, what people like you ought to do is look at people walking around the floor of Congress and who's talking to whom in between sessions. I have never forgotten that piece of advice. But I have thought about it recently, and I've thought about how hard it would be because you'd have to be able to identify the people milling. So you might have to have some really elderly Confederates would say, oh yeah, that's Senator so-and-so from such and such a place. But wouldn't that be interesting to look at the reach of partisanship in Congress by who simply chats up the person next to them down the hallway, or and have those chats been increasingly bifurcated by party? Is there less of the Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill kind of jawboning going on? And wouldn't it be wonderful to know the answer to that question? It would tell us so many wonderful things. It'd be a hard piece of research to do,
Yeah.
just on the basis of visual acuity of the people involved.
All right. Well, that's still a
But it's a
question in my
wonderful idea. I
mind.
hope someone does.
So let's give Rod Hart a great round of applause here for a very interesting lecture here, and giving us, I hope, all of you in the audience, including our wide receiver, a lot to think about and to research in the future.
Well,
We
thank
have-
you all so much for sharing your time with me.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. And we have another program on February 24th and another one on March 24th. So you all will be receiving more information on that, and I hope you'll be able to come back for that. Dr. Hart, again, thanks so much.
Bye, Ralph Webb.